Hello and welcome to Lone Star Silver Screen, a podcast about everything that exists at the intersection of Texas and the movies. I'm your host, Austin Zook, and today I am joined by filmmaker Matty Wishnow to talk about his new film, The Last Critic, about music critic extraordinaire Robert Christgau. Matty, you're going to be playing at the Oak Cliff Film Festival later this month. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Austin. Thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm thrilled to have you. I'm just going to get it out of the way up front. I loved this movie. I was not familiar with Christgau's work personally, and I think I might be his biggest fan now. Where did this project begin for you?
Sure. I've been a fan since my tweendom. I used to, I read Bob in The Village Voice. I'm from New York. But I first discovered Bob through his Consumer Guide books. He did these decade books, sort of compiling all of the Consumer Guide reviews he did each decade. So the origin story is I was a young reader and fan, and Bob sort of helped decode the musical universe for me in these short, sharp, 150-word, mini tomes. And many years later, sort of having a bit of a lapsed relationship with Bob. I mean, I still kept up with his writing, but not obsessively. Bob has obsessive fans, as you, having seen the movie, now know. But I was writing a book about entrepreneurship, and I was writing a chapter about the faculty of listening. And I was thinking about who are, the world's great listeners. And I sort of woke up, one morning with a bit of a thunderbolt, and I was like, oh, duh. I know who the world's greatest listener is because I've been reading him for decades. There is this man who has not just written more, but probably objectively listened to more music than anyone to ever walk the face of the earth. And that became sort of the log line initially, which was like the man who'd heard too much. And I approached two friends who are both filmmakers, both Austin-based. We all live in Austin, which makes this a bit of a Texas story, even though it's a New York movie. And just through crazy coincidence, one of those two friends, Paul Lovelace, who's the editor on the film, interned for Bob at NYU in college, and in the 90s shot a college thesis movie about Bob. So from the inception, we had 50 plus hours of archival footage. And that was sort of the universe telling me, this isn't just like a curious log line. There's something here.
Right. Now, one of the things I love about the film is that Bob is so upfront about his process. He lets you get footage of him sitting at his kitchen table, eating breakfast with just an album playing in the background. And he says, I don't sit here just quietly listening to the album. I want to be doing other things. I want the album to reach out and grab me and draw me in. And he says he'll listen to an album maybe 5 times before he writes his capsule review. He's so upfront and forthcoming about his process. Was there a challenge getting him to share that with you on film?
No, I mean, two observations. One, although Bob, I think many people would describe him as pretentious, which I really think when they're saying that, they mean maybe overly self-confident, certainly very cerebral and very intellectual. But Bob is actually devoid of pretense. Which is to say, the person you saw on screen, Austin, is Bob off screen. There's no vanity. When the camera's rolling, he's the same as when it's not rolling. And he was, as fastidious as he is as an editor and a writer, he really did not write or edit a minute of this movie. He didn't intervene. He didn't comment. There were no notes. He didn't even see the movie until final cut. So that's one thing I would say, is getting him to just be himself, show the process, expose how he does what he does, his relationships. That was easy. The other thing I would say, just in you describing his process, is something that was revealing to me, which is, I think I always imagined that a music critic would sort of raise their hand and say, I want to review this album. Mm-hmm. That's not how Bob works. Bob doesn't ask for an assignment. He just listens to dozens and dozens of records every month and waits for the music to call him sufficiently so that he would want to write about it. And that was like a real revelation for me, to sort of see this is not a person who picks favorites. It's a person who sort of waits for the music to connect with him, and then he sort of pays witness to it and reviews.
Well, and it's also, speaking about how he's a very direct person. He's the same on and off camera. I mean, you have moments in the film where I think it's Sonic Youth. You bring them in, and I mean, they're pretty upfront about kind of the relationship they've had with Bob's criticism, and they even wrote a song that included him. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, sure. In the mid 80s, Sonic Youth wrote a song called Kill Your Idols, which, sort of famously has a line about, I don't know why you want to impress Christgau, let that shit die. And find out the new goal. And I think a lot of people, maybe a generation below me, so millennials who are into indie rock, became aware of Christgau through that song. And as renowned as Bob is, he's renowned in part because of his longevity and his sort of prodigious output at The Voice. He's also renowned now because he's highly online. He is a Wikipedia footnote in almost every canonical artist page on Wikipedia, so he's very indexed online. But for every one person who is obsessed with Christgau and loves him, there's 10 people that can't stand him, that either can't stand how he writes, or I would say, moreover, can't stand how he assesses music that they love. So if you like progressive rock, or if you like James Taylor, if you were Thurston Moore and in the mid 80s and you liked a bunch of these sort of New York avant-garde art rock bands, which Bob had very little patience for, people have big feelings about Bob even to this day. And one thing I'll say about Thurston, who was a wonderful interview subject, is as much as Thurston bristled at Bob in the mid 80s, Thurston is a bit of a Christgau file. Like, he's done the work. He's read Bob's writing. He could cite reviews verbatim. So it was a pleasure talking to him because he sort of represented both sides of the argument.
Well, and I would say even in that interview, I mean, you obviously they've butted heads or whatever in the past, but you don't get the sense that Thurston Moore just hates Christgau at all. Like, I mean, there does seem to be kind of this, like, you know what, the man does what he does and he is committed to it, and we may not agree, but like, he is Bob Christgau.
Yeah, yeah. I think Thurston was a fan at one point. I think that they have, an evolved and mature relationship. They did. I think at some point in the 90s, they did break bread to sort of try to have a rapprochement. And by the way, I think what's most important to note is that Bob warmed to Sonic Youth. I mean, Sonic Youth in the 90s became one of Bob's favorite rock bands. They were consistently graded highly. And I think that meant something to Thurston Moore. That, I think that approval, as sort of anti-establishment as Sonic Youth were, was meaningful to Thurston. I think you can kind of see it in the movie.
Well, and I think that's one of the other great things about Christgau, and one of the things that you kind of tease out over the course of this documentary, is that he is willing to not necessarily go back on what he's written before, but he's willing to give an artist another chance and, say, okay, that album doesn't work for me for whatever reason, but they've got something new out. I'll give it a listen, and maybe I'll fall in love with it this time.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, the inverse is true. There are artists that Bob fell in love with early on who he had sort of no patience in later in their career. There's a lot of Van Morrison albums, that Bob was sort of brutal to after, a run of sort of unimpeachable reviews that Bob provided in the early 70s. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that is the unique thing about Christgau, having had this long arc, which is, you can see how his reactions evolve. And you can also see how he's really listening album by album. He doesn't have recency bias. He doesn't sort of have the bias of sunk costs. Like, if there's an album that he doesn't like, if the last album was an A+, it does not affect how he reviews the next album. And that is why those, 17, 18,000 album reviews represent like a unique canon. There's sort of like the Rolling Stone Jan Wenner canon, and then I suppose there's maybe like a Pitchfork canon, but I think Christgau's in some ways is the most accurate, being a relative term. I think it is maybe the most honest, in that it is one person reacting in real time to 60 years of music. And really, you can see it in the movie, doing the work and paying witness to each album in real time, as opposed to thinking about it as canon building or reputation building. Like, Bob was not part of the apparatus of the music industry. He was not part of Rolling Stone. After he left The Voice, he called his column expert witness, because that's what he viewed his job as being not just a witness, but an expert witness to the music he was listening to.
So I wanted to ask, one of the things that you get watching this documentary is there's a sense that Christgau has almost a soft spot for up and coming hip hop and rap artists, which I think people would assume that men of a certain age don't have time for. But he really does seem to have kind of a burgeoning passion for it. I mean, is that something that he explored at all in his conversations with you?
For sure. I mean, Bob and the Village Voice more broadly, I think, did a lot of great work for music, but I think maybe their two greatest contributions were the attention that they paid to hip hop early on, as early as like the late 70s, early 80s, and then also to world music, but specifically African pop music. Now, obviously, there were other people writing about this, and also obviously, Bob is not some white knight, sort of bringing black music to bear in America. So it was important to me to have, Nelson George and retrospectively Greg Tate and other writers from The Voice sort of putting this into context. Bob wasn't the vehicle, but Bob certainly created space so that other great writers could champion music that he thought was really important. And Bob has famous deaf spots. His famous deaf spots are like progressive rock and heavy metal and maybe some singer-songwriter stuff. But he also has positive biases. I think anything like very rhythmic, very hooky, and also where there's a sense of like social justice and equity in like explicitly or implicitly in the music, Bob will give it a second listen. And I think that was more what I was trying to get at in the movie in exploring Bob's relationship to hip hop and African pop music.
So you mentioned some of the people who you brought in as kind of talking heads for this, and you've got a murderer's row of talent on camera here. I mean, just off the top of my head, Colson Whitehead, Greg Tate, Yossi Salig. I mean, these are people who I personally love, and it was so cool seeing them in this documentary. Was there anyone it was really challenging to get, or anyone you really wanted to get who you couldn't?
Well, let me start with the positive, which is, I'm a first-time filmmaker, and I was literally writing people to their email using my personal email, a name they didn't know, a name that has like no IMDb, and almost every person I wrote responded immediately. All I said was, documentary feature about Robert Christgau. And, Pulitzer Prize winning authors, famous rock critics, musicians, we got Randy Newman, Boots Riley, you mentioned Colson Whitehead, Greil Marcus, like all these people just responded normally within like 24 hours and said, yes, I'm in. The two white whales I was chasing but didn't get were, I really wanted Questlove in the movie. Questlove's a big Christgau reader, but he's also probably like the busiest person in entertainment. So by the way, it wasn't from a lack of response. It was simply a scheduling issue. And the other person I really wanted but couldn't get, I think for different reasons, was Billy Joel. Thurston Moore ends up playing like a proxy for like a challenger argument. But I really, Billy Joel, I think sort of famously really bristled at Bob and his reviews. Obviously, Lou Reed had passed. Lou Reed was not an option. So Billy Joel was the other person I wanted to get. No response from that camp.
So I wanted to ask, talking about you as a first-time filmmaker, when I sat down to watch this, I hadn't done any background research. I just went in totally cold. And I mean, it just seems so incredibly well structured, and you've got a great balance between stuff with Christgau that you filmed and archival footage and things you filmed with talking heads. I mean, what was it like for you just piecing this together as someone who's never really done this before?
Yeah, well, I think there's like the two-dimensional part of a movie, which is, sort of narrative and production design. And then there's the three-dimensional part, which is like cinematography and moving through a world. And so first and foremost, I would say that my co-producers, Ben Wu and Paul Lovelace, are experienced filmmakers. Ben's a cinematographer, Paul's an editor. So I was in very steady hands. And I do have a background in design and I write a lot. So I was pretty confident in the storytelling, the structure and production design. Like I knew how I wanted it to look, like very clearly. And I also knew the story I did and didn't want to tell. And also when you're dealing with a person who's of a certain age who lives in a confined space, you have constraints set on you, which for me were positive. There was a lot that I couldn't say or do just because of the nature of making a movie about an 80-something-year-old man. On the other hand, the cinematic aspects, like the cinematography was something that I would very much had to lean on Ben for and sort of say what I wanted to communicate, and we would go back and forth. So, I felt confident in the 2 dimensions. The 3 dimensions, I really kind of had to apprentice and learn along the way. But fortunately, this is not a sweeping epic movie. I was not telling a full 80-year story. I was not, traversing cities, states, and countries. Like, this is a fairly contained movie, and I had other benchmarks for it. So I felt confident that within those positive constraints, we could make this look good and sound good and narratively cogent.
Over the course of filming and editing this together, I mean, was there anything that surprised you or that you didn't expect to capture?
So I think the biggest thing is when we first started, I made an important decision, which is I wanted every talking head, every interview subject to read a number of Bob's reviews with the idea that we would edit them together and then animate the reviews coming to life. And I wanted to capture kind of the fandom of the talking heads, sometimes musicians, sometimes writers, kind of falling in love with Bob's writing again. And then I also wanted the audience to sort of react positively and negatively to these sharp, sometimes impenetrable reviews. What I didn't appreciate, which has been honestly the greatest joy of the entire process, is watching an audience full of people laugh or gasp or just sort of react in very demonstrative ways to these reviews, because nobody has the experience of like reading Christgau in a group setting. It's like, no, why would anyone do that? It's like a weird thing. So allowing people who love or hate or have never been exposed to Bob's writing to experience it in a group setting has been, oh my God, it's been so revealing. Like the reaction that I had as an individual reader, which was like, I strong agree, I hard disagree, or like, what the hell is he talking about? When you get that with 100 or 200 people in a room, it becomes like, it becomes like a communal experience, and it's so much more fun.
That is awesome. Yeah, I think that's one of my favorite touches in the documentary is having the talking heads read those reviews, because not only do they read the reviews, but then like usually you'll have like a reaction right after where they're kind of like, "Oh my God, I can't believe he said that." Or like in the Boots Riley portion where he's like, "I really appreciate that he wrote this because, you can tell he really gets it." And it really does add some context to the review, and it makes you appreciate the impact that it's had on these other very famous reviewers.
Yeah. It only works if the language is very lively. And I do think that there is like a rhythm and meter and also humor to it that makes it work, because all of those reactions are genuine.
Well, I think maybe the first one you have them read, like the kicker is someone needs to fold up their dick and go home.
Yeah, yeah. That's the famous Prince Dirty Mind review, and we had to have that in the first 10 minutes for sure.
Yeah, that was so good. Now, as far as the release goes, I mean, right now you're on the festival circuit. Are there plans to make this more widely available to audiences?
For sure. I mean, so we're going to be on the festival circuit for the balance of the year. So we're going to be traveling most of America and, in fact, a lot of the world between now and, I would say, the end of the year. Now, it's already clear to me that in certain major American cities, this will play well in theaters. We've had a lot of exhibitors already reach out. So we are trying to figure out, like, how do we give this a life? Is it going to be through a studio? Will we book it ourselves before we have a long, hopefully successful life on a streamer? But, there's going to be at least 10 to 15 other festivals between now and the end of the year. Obviously, you know, uh, you know, you and I are both based in Texas, and I'm very excited for Oak Cliff, at the end of July. But we're going to be, heading both coasts, Midwest and back in the Northeast, and throughout Europe for the balance of the year. There's always surprises. I guess theoretically the movie could get acquired before festival season's over. But at this point, my expectation is like finish festival season and then, do a handful of, maybe more than a handful, hopefully, a bunch of rep theaters in the States, and then probably some places around the world in early 2027.
Okay. Before we wrap up, one more question that I wanted to ask you. We've talked a lot about kind of Christgau's work as a critic, but one of the other things your documentary focuses on, and you mentioned it earlier, was Christgau, the editor. And there's some really fun bits where you're kind of showing a page that's been marked up by him, and you have some of his former writers who are talking about the experience of being edited by Bob Christgau, which sounds like it could be pretty intense.
Mhm.
I mean, were they all universally, I mean, pretty pleased to have worked with him and appreciative of that experience?
I mean, the reaction amongst people who are edited by Bob is uniform, which is excruciating, painstaking, intimidating, but also the best editor that they ever had. Like that's why Coulson, Whitehead's in the movie, I think, as much for his appreciation of Bob's writing as for Bob, the editor. And, sort of if you think of Bob as like a head coach, the coaching tree of writers and editors that were born out of Bob's style and the Village Voice is, I think, maybe his proudest achievement outside of maybe his family. Bob is more sort of vocal about and demonstrative about the quality of his editing than he is about his own writing. Not that he's not proud of his writing, but he's really, really proud of his of sort of the family of writers that he edited. And you can see why. I mean, he is painstaking and exacting and brutal, but the work speaks for itself. I mean, truly the greatest living, music and cultural critics either come directly out of Bob's coaching tree or were influenced by people who were influenced by Bob.
Matty, as we wrap up, I end every interview on this show by asking my guests, what's something you love about Texas? What have you got for me?
Well, I mean, so much. I live in Austin. I'm going to give the most obvious answer, which is breakfast tacos.
I love it.
I've lived in Austin for 15 years, but I spent the previous 35 in the Northeast. And the idea of a breakfast taco for all of my childhood and young adulthood, it didn't even exist. I'd never even heard of it. And then, my first time visiting Austin was in the early 90s. And it is such a simple, incredible pleasure. And when done right is like the perfect dish. So yeah, breakfast tacos.
I love it. You're my first breakfast taco. So you get to carve that onto the Mount Rushmore of answers.
Great. I'll take it.
All right, man. Well, thank you so much. As we've already mentioned, the film is going to be playing at the Oak Cliff Film Festival at the end of this month. Where can people go if they want to follow the movie's journey or keep up with you and your work?
Yeah, I mean, 2 places. The website is www.thelastcriticfilm.com. And we're on Instagram at The Last Critic Film as well. We try to keep it simple, so you'll find it all there. And I should also pimp briefly for Bob's Substack, which is incredible. So Bob has a very active, very successful Substack called And It Don't Stop. And if anyone wants to read Bob, they should subscribe there.
Fantastic. Matty, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a real pleasure.
Yeah, my pleasure, Austin. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed the show, please remember to rate, review, and follow us wherever it is you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram at Lone Star Film Pod. We'll be back soon with another new episode, but in the meantime, we'll see you at the movies and on the dusty trails of Texas. Bye.